Captain Jake Morrison had been in diplomatic situations before, but none quite like being escorted to an alien palace by fighters that looked like they'd been carved from living crystal and bad intentions. His shuttle, the Harmony's Edge, rattled as another Zephyrian interceptor performed what he could only describe as an aggressive greeting maneuver off his starboard wing. "Captain," came the nervous voice of Lieutenant Rodriguez through his comm, "our escort just increased to 12 ships. Either they're really excited to meet us, or they're planning something that doesn't involve a welcoming committee." Jake watched the elegant alien fighters weave around his shuttle in patterns that defied several laws of physics he'd thought were fairly well established. "Probably both, Rodriguez. Remember, we're here to prevent a war, not start one. Even if their idea of hospitality involves what appears to be an interpretive dance performed by weaponized jewelry." The planet Zephyria dominated the view screen ahead, a world of impossible beauty where crystal formations jutted from continents like frozen lightning, and auroras danced in broad daylight across skies that shifted between silver and gold. According to the briefing files, the Zephyrians had controlled this sector for over 3 millennia, which made humanity's recent expansion into neighboring systems about as welcome as a meteor shower at a wedding. "Incoming transmission from the lead fighter," Rodriguez reported. The communication screen flickered to life, revealing a Zephyrian pilot whose features were almost perfectly human except for the distinctively pointed ears that swept back from her head like elegant wings. Her voice carried harmonics that seemed to bypass Jake's ears and resonate directly in his chest. "Human vessel, you will follow the prescribed approach vector to the Imperial Palace. Any deviation will be interpreted as hostile intent and responded to accordingly." "Understood," Jake replied, trying to project calm confidence while privately wondering if responded to accordingly meant politely asked to reconsider or converted to component atoms. Captain Morrison of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, requesting permission to land for the scheduled audience with Empress Vexra. The pilot's expression suggested she found his existence mildly offensive but tolerable. "Permission granted, Captain Morrison. Try not to crash into anything. The Empress dislikes having to clean human debris from her landing platforms." The transmission cut out, leaving Jake to contemplate whether that had been a joke, a threat, or useful safety information. The Imperial Palace emerged from Zephyria's crystal-studded landscape like a fevered dream of impossible architecture. Spires twisted skyward in spirals that seemed to defy gravity, connected by bridges of solid light that sparkled with their own internal illumination. The structure appeared to be grown rather than built, as if some cosmic gardener had planted seeds of pure crystalline beauty and waited for them to bloom into magnificence. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "the power readings from that palace are off the charts. Whatever they're using for energy, it's generating more output than our entire fleet. Let's hope they use all that power for impressive light shows and not for turning visiting diplomats into very small particles," Jake muttered, guiding his shuttle toward the designated landing platform. The landing pad itself was a masterpiece of engineering that somehow managed to be both functional and artistic. Crystalline formations rose around the edges like frozen waterfalls, and the surface beneath his shuttle's landing gear felt solid despite appearing to be made of captured starlight. Jake stepped out of his shuttle and immediately understood why the Zephyrians considered themselves superior to most galactic civilizations. The air itself seemed to shimmer with energy, and every surface reflected light in ways that created an constantly shifting display of beauty that would have made the greatest human artists weep with envy. "Captain Morrison," came a voice that sounded like music played on instruments made of wind and silver. He turned to see a delegation of Zephyrians approaching, led by a tall figure whose ceremonial robes seemed to be cut from fabric that existed partially in another dimension. The being's pointed ears were adorned with crystalline ornaments that chimed softly with each step. "I am Chancellor Thyrix, advisor to Her Imperial Majesty. The Empress awaits your presence in the throne chamber. Please follow, and try not to touch anything. Our security systems are sensitive to unfamiliar genetic patterns." Jake fell into step behind the Chancellor, trying not to gawk at the palace's interior like a tourist at his first space station. The corridors were lined with what appeared to be living crystal formations that pulsed gently with inner light, responding to the presence of the Zephyrian delegation with warm golden hues while casting distinctly cooler blue tones around Jake himself. The palace seems to have opinions about visitors, Jake observed. The crystal matrices are attuned to Zephyrian biorhythms, Chancellor Thyrix explained without looking back. They find human neural patterns discordant. Please do not take it personally. I'll try not to have my feelings hurt by architecture, Jake replied. They passed through chambers that defied reasonable description, rooms where waterfalls flowed upward into pools of liquid light, galleries displaying art that shifted and changed based on the viewer's emotional state, and corridors where the walls themselves seemed to sing in harmonies that Jake could feel in his bones. Finally, they reached the throne chamber. The room was vast enough to have its own weather system, with a domed ceiling that appeared to contain an actual piece of captured sky complete with drifting clouds and distant stars. Crystalline formations jutted from the walls like frozen lightning, and the floor was a mirror-smooth surface that reflected not just images but seemed to capture and replay moments of movement like ripples in time itself. And there, seated on a throne that appeared to be carved from a single massive diamond, was Empress Vexera. Jake's diplomatic training had prepared him for many scenarios, but none had covered what to do when confronted with someone who radiated authority like a personal gravitational field. The Empress was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, like lightning or supernovas or perfectly calibrated weapons. Her armor seemed to be grown rather than forged, following the elegant lines of her body while providing protection that probably made tank armor look like tissue paper. Her pointed ears swept back from her head in graceful curves that caught and reflected the chamber's shifting lights like prisms, and her amber eyes held an intelligence that suggested she'd already analyzed every possible outcome of their meeting before Jake had even entered the room. In her right hand, she held what could only be described as a sword made of contained energy, a blade of pure light that hummed with barely restrained power and cast shifting patterns of illumination across the throne room's crystal surfaces. Captain Morrison, Empress Vexera said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions Jake couldn't quite perceive. You have come to prevent a war between our peoples. Yes, Your Majesty, Jake replied, grateful that his voice remained steady despite feeling like he was trying to negotiate with a force of nature. I believe our civilizations have more to gain from cooperation than conflict. The Empress's laughter was like wind chimes in a storm, beautiful, musical, and slightly ominous. How refreshingly optimistic. Tell me, Captain, what makes you believe that your species has anything to offer the Zephyrian Empire beyond target practice for our weapon systems? Jake had faced hostile alien species before, but none had managed to make threats sound quite so elegant. Empress Vexera's question hung in the crystalline air like a challenge wrapped in silk and dipped in liquid starlight. Well, Jake said, deciding that diplomatic doublespeak would probably get him vaporized by someone who could apparently cut through solid crystal with a sword made of concentrated energy. Humans are excellent at making mistakes and then figuring out creative ways to fix them. We've turned disaster recovery into an art form. The Empress tilted her head, her pointed ears catching the chamber's shifting light patterns. An interesting perspective. Most species emphasize their strengths rather than their failures. Most species probably haven't had to rebuild their civilization as many times as we have, Jake replied. We're like the galactic equivalent of that friend who keeps crashing their speeder but somehow always manages to fix it with spare parts and creative engineering. A sound that might have been laughter, or possibly the crystalline equivalent of a snort, echoed from Chancellor Thyrix's direction. Empress Vexera rose from her throne with fluid grace, the energy blade in her hand casting dancing shadows across the chamber walls. Your humor is unexpected, Captain Morrison. But humor will not resolve the territorial disputes between our peoples, nor will it address the fundamental incompatibility of our civilizations. Maybe not, Jake agreed, watching as she descended the steps toward him with the predatory elegance of someone who had never encountered anything she couldn't either conquer or outlast. But it might help us find common ground. After all, any species that builds palaces this beautiful clearly appreciates the finer things in existence. Flattery, Captain. The Empress stopped a few meters away from him, close enough that Jake could see the intricate patterns etched into her armor, designs that seemed to shift and flow like living art. Observation, he corrected. I'm a soldier, Your Majesty, not a poet. When I see something remarkable, I tend to call it what it is. Empress Vexera studied him with those amber eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his appearance, his stance, his breathing patterns. Jake had the distinct impression of being analyzed by someone whose idea of casual observation could probably be classified as a military-grade intelligence-gathering operation. "Tell me, Captain," she said, beginning to pace around him in a circle that was probably meant to be intimidating but mostly made Jake think of a very elegant and potentially lethal cat, "what do you know of Zephyrian traditions?" "Enough to know that I probably don't know nearly enough," Jake replied honestly. "Your culture is ancient, sophisticated, and values honor above almost everything else. You've maintained peace in this sector for 3 millennia through a combination of superior technology and judicious application of force. Also, your architectural aesthetic makes human cities look like they were designed by particularly uninspired children using building blocks. Accurate, if somewhat irreverent." The Empress completed her circle and stood facing him directly. "But there is one tradition you have not mentioned. The ritual of Kethmoran." Jake's diplomatic briefings hadn't covered that particular term, which meant it was either extremely obscure, extremely classified, or extremely recent. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with it, Your Majesty. Kethmoran is the ancient method by which Zephyrian leaders resolve disputes that cannot be settled through conventional negotiation." The energy blade in her hand began to hum more loudly, its light casting ever-shifting patterns across her face. "It offers 2 paths, Kethval, the way of combat, where opponents settle their differences through strength of arms, or Kethmiran, the way of bonding, where leaders create an unbreakable psychic link between themselves and, by extension, their peoples." Jake felt his heart rate increase slightly, though whether from the obvious implications of ritual combat or the more mysterious implications of psychic bonding, he wasn't entirely sure. "And you're suggesting?" "I am offering you a choice, Captain Morrison." Empress Vexera raised her energy blade until its point was level with his chest, the weapon humming with barely contained power. "We can settle the dispute between our civilizations through Kethval, single combat between us, here and now. Winner takes all, loser becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of picking fights with superior opponents." Jake nodded slowly. "And the alternative?" "Kethmiran. A bonding ritual that would create a permanent psychic link between us, joining our consciousness and, symbolically, our civilizations. It would end the territorial disputes by making them irrelevant, our peoples would be united under a shared leadership." "That sounds..." Jake paused, trying to find diplomatic phrasing for absolutely terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. "Complicated." "Indeed." The Empress lowered her blade slightly, but her expression remained serious. "I should mention that Kethmiran has been attempted 3 times in our history. All 3 attempts resulted in the death of my intended partner. The psychic strain of bonding with Zephyrian consciousness has proven challenging for alien physiology." "You mean it killed them?" Jake said flatly. "Regrettably, yes. Their neural patterns could not adapt to the connection. They essentially burned out like overloaded circuits." Her amber eyes held something that might have been regret. "So perhaps Kethval would be the wiser choice. At least combat offers the possibility of a quick, clean death." Chancellor Thyric stepped forward from his position near the throne. "Your Majesty, surely the human is too weak for either option. Perhaps we should simply proceed with the territorial annexation as planned." "The human can speak for himself, Thyric," the Empress said without taking her eyes off Jake. "Well, Captain. Fight me or bond with me. Choose quickly, my patience has limits, and my schedule includes several other potential diplomatic crises before dinner." Jake looked at the energy blade still pointed in his general direction, then at the woman holding it. Empress Vexera was dangerous, clearly, but beneath the imperial authority and casual threats of dismemberment, he caught glimpses of something else. Loneliness, maybe. The burden of making decisions that affected billions of lives. The weight of being the only person in your civilization who couldn't share that responsibility with anyone else. "Can I ask a question first?" he said. "You may ask. I make no promises about answering. If we choose Kethmiran and I survive the bonding process, what exactly would that mean for both our peoples?" The Empress considered this. United leadership. Shared resources. Cultural exchange. An end to territorial disputes because the concept of us versus them becomes meaningless when us includes everyone. She paused. Also, you would become my consort and co-ruler of the Zephyrian Empire, which comes with excellent health benefits but requires learning approximately 47 different protocols for formal state dinners. 47. Jake asked. 48 if you count the ritual for greeting visiting dignitaries from the Crab Nebula, but they only visit during leap years and their definition of politeness involves a lot of ceremonial pinching. Despite everything, the weapons, the life or death choices, the casual mention of psychic bonding that could result in his brain becoming the equivalent of an overloaded power grid, Jake found himself smiling. "Your Majesty," he said, "I think I've made my decision." Jake stepped forward and, to the surprise of everyone in the throne chamber including himself, reached not for the weapon at his side but for Empress Vexera's free hand. "I choose Kethmiran," he said, his fingers closing gently around hers. The bonding ritual. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the crystalline formations around the chamber humming their harmonic songs. Chancellor Thyrix's expression suggested he was witnessing either an act of unprecedented courage or spectacular stupidity, possibly both. "You understand," Empress Vexera said slowly, "that this choice could kill you? That 3 other beings, far more psychically developed than humans, died attempting what you've just volunteered for?" "I understand," Jake replied. "But I also understand that someone has to be willing to take the risk if we want to end this conflict. Besides, humans have a terrible habit of surviving things that should probably kill us. We're annoyingly resilient that way." The Empress studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face for something, doubt, perhaps, or hidden motives. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why choose a path that could result in your death when combat might at least offer you a fighting chance?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Because I've seen what war does to people, to civilizations. I've seen planets turned into graveyards and entire species reduced to refugee populations. If there's a chance, even a small one, that we can build something better than conflict, then I think it's worth the risk. Even if that risk is your life. Especially then." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Besides, Your Majesty, you strike me as someone who's been carrying the weight of leadership alone for a very long time. If the bonding works, maybe you won't have to do that anymore." Something shifted in the Empress's expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition. "You think I'm lonely," she said. "I think you're responsible for an entire civilization's well-being, which probably doesn't leave much time for personal connections," Jake replied. "I think you've made this offer 3 times before, hoping each time that it would work, that you'd finally have someone who could truly understand the burden you carry. And I think you keep trying because the alternative is accepting that you'll always be alone." Chancellor Thyrix cleared his throat with a sound like wind chimes being strangled. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss the political implications." "The political implications are irrelevant if Captain Morrison dies during the ritual," the Empress cut him off. "And if he survives, the political landscape will be fundamentally altered anyway." She looked back at Jake. "Very well. We proceed to the heart chamber." The heart chamber turned out to be located deep within the palace's core, accessible only through a series of crystalline corridors that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Jake's sense of direction became completely useless as they descended through passages where the walls curved in directions that hurt to think about too deeply. "The chamber amplifies psychic energy," Empress Vexera explained as they walked. "It will facilitate the bonding process, but it will also magnify any incompatibilities between our consciousness patterns. If your neural structure cannot adapt to the connection, I become a very expensive cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence, Jake finished. I get it. Question, though, what exactly happens during a successful bonding? I mean, practically speaking. Our minds will merge temporarily, sharing memories, emotions, and thought patterns. If the connection stabilizes, we'll maintain a permanent psychic link. I'll always be able to sense your thoughts and feelings, and you'll have access to mine. We'll also share certain abilities. You'll gain some measure of Zephyrian psychic sensitivity, while I'll acquire aspects of human adaptability and resilience. So basically, we become a very exclusive two-person mental network, Jake said. That's either incredibly romantic or the ultimate violation of privacy, depending on how you look at it. Both, the Empress admitted. Zephyrian bonding partners traditionally spend years learning to maintain individual identity within a shared consciousness. It requires a level of mental discipline that. She stopped abruptly as they entered the heart chamber, and Jake immediately understood why. The chamber was a sphere of pure crystal perhaps 50 meters in diameter, its walls pulsing with inner light that seemed to beat in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. Massive formations jutted from the curved surfaces like frozen lightning, and the air itself hummed with energy that made Jake's hair stand on end and his teeth ache. Impressive, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm guessing this is where the magic happens. The science happens, Empress Vexera corrected, though she seemed amused by his phrasing. The crystal matrices will amplify our bioelectric fields and facilitate the neural bridging process. You'll need to place your hands on the central focus crystal while I initiate the connection sequence. Jake looked at the massive crystal formation in the chamber's center, a structure that seemed to contain captured starlight and impossible geometries in equal measure. And if something goes wrong? Then the chamber will contain the psychic feedback and prevent it from affecting the rest of the palace. Think of it as a very sophisticated safety net. For my exploding brain. Essentially, yes. Jake approached the central crystal, placing his palms against its surprisingly warm surface. You know, Your Majesty, when I accepted this diplomatic mission, my biggest concern was remembering which fork to use during formal dinners. The Empress moved to the opposite side of the crystal, her hands mirroring his position. Are you having second thoughts? Definitely, Jake said. But I'm having them while keeping my hands exactly where they are, so I think we can proceed. Very well. The chamber's humming increased in intensity as the Empress closed her eyes. Remember, do not fight the connection. Let your consciousness flow with mine, even when it feels like you're drowning in alien thoughts. Reassuring, Jake muttered, then felt the first tendrils of foreign consciousness brush against his mind like whispers made of electricity and starlight. The initial contact was gentle, Vexera's thoughts touching his own with careful curiosity. Jake experienced flashes of her memories. The weight of a crown placed on her head centuries ago, the loneliness of making decisions that could reshape civilizations, the secret fear that she might not be worthy of the trust her people placed in her. Then the connection deepened, and Jake's mind was flooded with sensations that had no human equivalent. He felt the psychic resonance of crystal formations responding to thought, experienced the flow of energy between dimensions, perceived time not as a linear progression but as a vast ocean in which past, present, and future existed simultaneously. His own memories flowed back along the connection, Earth's blue skies and impossible diversity, humanity's wars and recoveries, the moment he'd first looked up at stars and wondered what lay beyond them. He felt Vexera's surprise at the intensity of human emotions, her fascination with the chaos and creativity that defined his species. The bonding process accelerated, their consciousness beginning to merge more completely. Jake felt his sense of individual identity starting to blur at the edges, becoming part of something larger and more complex than either of them alone. That's when the explosion started. The chamber shook violently as something struck the palace above them. Alarms began wailing throughout the crystalline structure, and Jake felt the psychic connection wavering as Vexera's attention was torn between the bonding ritual and whatever crisis was unfolding outside. What's happening? He managed to ask, though speaking required conscious effort when his thoughts were scattered across multiple levels of consciousness. "Sabotage," Vexera replied, her mental voice tense with anger and concern. "Someone is trying to disrupt the ritual." Through their partially formed bond, Jake sensed her accessing the palace's communication systems with her mind. Images flowed between them. Human and Zephyrian ships engaged in combat above the planet, explosions rocking the palace's outer structures, and armed figures moving through the corridors toward the heart chamber. "Extremists from both our species," Vexera said grimly. "They've allied to prevent the bonding from succeeding." The chamber's crystal formations began to crack under the strain of the interrupted ritual, sending sparks of psychic energy cascading through the air like lightning. Jake felt their incomplete bond starting to tear apart, taking pieces of his consciousness with it. "We have to complete the connection," he said, fighting to maintain focus as another explosion sent tremors through the chamber. "If we don't finish this now, we'll both die," Vexera finished. "And our peoples will remain at war." Jake pressed his hands more firmly against the crystal, ignoring the pain that shot through his nervous system. "Then we'd better work fast." The heart chamber's entrance exploded inward in a shower of crystalline fragments and poorly planned military strategy. Through the smoke emerged a mixed group of human marines and Zephyrian warriors, all wearing expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else but had been convinced that preventing an interspecies alliance was somehow worth risking their lives in a psychically charged crystal cave. "Step away from the Empress," shouted the lead human officer, a colonel whose tactical vest was covered in enough insignia to indicate either impressive military service or an unhealthy obsession with collecting merit badges. "Empress Vexera, cease this abomination," added a Zephyrian warrior whose armor was so ornate it probably had its own gravitational field. "The purity of our bloodline must not be compromised." Jake, who was currently experiencing consciousness on approximately 17 different levels simultaneously, found their timing remarkably poor. "You know," he called out, not removing his hands from the crystal focus, "there's probably a more diplomatic way to express your concerns about our foreign policy decisions." The partially completed psychic bond was making communication interesting. He could feel Vexera's amusement at his comment mixing with her genuine anger at the interruption, while also experiencing her assessment of their tactical situation and her growing certainty that they were all about to become casualties of very bad timing. "Jake," she said, her voice carrying harmonics from dimensions that probably weren't supposed to exist, "we need to complete the bonding now, or the psychic feedback will kill us both." "Working on it," he replied, trying to ignore the fact that several weapons were now pointed in their general direction. "Though I have to say, your extremists have excellent timing. Do they always wait for the most dramatically inconvenient moment to stage their interventions?" "It's a tradition," Vexera said grimly. "Very tiresome." The lead colonel stepped forward, his weapon trained on Jake. "Captain Morrison, you're under arrest for exceeding your diplomatic authority and engaging in unauthorized alien bonding rituals. Whatever they've done to your mind, we can fix it back on Earth." "That's very thoughtful," Jake said, feeling the crystal matrix around them beginning to destabilize as the interrupted ritual sent feedback surges through the chamber's energy grid. "But I'm going to have to decline your offer of rescue. We're kind of in the middle of something important here." The Zephyrian warrior raised what appeared to be a weapon that fired concentrated starlight. "Human, release our Empress from your contaminating influence, or face the consequences." "You know what's funny?" Jake said, his consciousness now spread across enough dimensional planes to perceive the cosmic humor in their situation. "You're all so worried about contamination and purity that you're missing the point entirely." Through their growing bond, he could feel Vexera's surprise at his sudden calm in the face of multiple armed opponents and imminent psychic combustion. "The point?" the colonel demanded. Jake smiled, even as energy discharges from the destabilizing crystal formations began arcing around the chamber like very aggressive mood lighting. "The point is that your so-called pure civilizations have been at each other's throats for months over territory and resources. But in the last few minutes, I've experienced Empress Vexera's memories, her hopes for her people, her fears about making the right decisions. And she's experienced mine, humanity's chaos, our resilience, our tendency to find solutions in impossible situations. The psychic bond pulsed between them, growing stronger despite the chamber's increasing instability. "And what we've discovered," Vexra added, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated directly in the minds of everyone present, "is that our species complement each other perfectly. Human adaptability balances Zephyrian wisdom. Your emotional resilience stabilizes our psychic sensitivity." More importantly, Jake continued, feeling the bond snap into place with a sensation like coming home after a very long journey through hostile territory, "we've discovered that working together, we can do things neither of us could accomplish alone." The completed psychic link between them created something neither had expected, a hybrid consciousness that could interface directly with both human technology and Zephyrian crystal networks. Jake felt his awareness expand to encompass the palace's entire defensive grid, while Vexra gained access to the tactical analysis capabilities of the human ships in orbit. For example, Jake said, his consciousness now linked to every system in the palace, "We can do this." The chamber's crystal formation stopped crackling with unstable energy and began to sing in perfect harmony. Throughout the palace, defensive systems activated with precision that reflected both human strategic thinking and Zephyrian technological mastery. The mixed group of extremists found themselves surrounded by barriers of solid light while their weapons were disabled by targeted electromagnetic pulses. "How?" the colonel began. "Hybrid consciousness," Vexra explained, her thoughts flowing seamlessly with Jake's as they coordinated the palace's response to the intrusion. "We can think in human tactical patterns while executing solutions through Zephyrian technology. It's remarkably efficient." Through their bond, Jake accessed the palace's communication systems and opened channels to both the human and Zephyrian fleets still engaged in combat above the planet. "Attention all vessels," he broadcast, his voice carrying on frequencies that reached every ship simultaneously. "This is Captain Jake Morrison and Empress Vexra, speaking as joint leaders of the new Human-Zephyrian Alliance. The bonding ritual has been completed successfully, and hostilities will cease immediately." The response was immediate, confusion from both fleets as their sensors detected the impossible, human and Zephyrian consciousness patterns operating in perfect synchronization from the same location. Furthermore, Vexra added, her thoughts intertwining with Jake's to create a communication that was simultaneously tactical briefing and diplomatic proclamation. "Any personnel who participated in the sabotage attempt will be dealt with according to Joint Alliance protocols, which we're making up as we go along but will definitely involve a lot of very boring paperwork." The colonel lowered his weapon, looking stunned. "Captain, what have you done?" "Prevented a war, solved a territorial dispute, and probably revolutionized interspecies diplomacy," Jake replied cheerfully. "Also, I appear to have gotten married to an alien empress, which was definitely not in my mission briefing but seems to be working out reasonably well." Through their psychic link, Jake felt Vexra's amusement mixing with affection and a deep sense of relief that the gamble had paid off. "The bonding is stable," she announced to the chamber. "Jake's neural patterns have not only survived the connection but enhanced it. We are truly unified." The Zephyrian warrior who had been calling for purity looked like he was having a philosophical crisis. "But, the bloodlines, the traditions. Will evolve," Vexra said firmly. "As they always have. That's what keeps civilizations alive, the willingness to grow beyond what they were." Jake accessed the palace's historical archives through his new connection to Zephyrian systems, skimming millennia of records in seconds. "You know, according to your own history, the Zephyrian Empire has successfully integrated 14 different species over the past 3,000 years. Adding humans to that list isn't exactly revolutionary, it's traditional." The chamber's crisis had passed, but the real work was just beginning. Over the following hours, Jake and Vexra used their unprecedented combined consciousness to coordinate a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Human ships and Zephyrian vessels began working together to establish joint patrols, while diplomatic teams from both species found themselves dealing with negotiators who could literally see both sides of every issue simultaneously. "This is going to take some getting used to," Jake admitted as they stood together on the palace's main balcony, watching human and Zephyrian ships flying in formation against the backdrop of Zephyria's impossible sky. The psychic link? Vexura asked, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity of someone who could sense his emotions as clearly as her own. All of it. The link, the marriage, becoming co-ruler of an interstellar empire, learning 47 different dinner protocols. Jake paused. Actually, especially the dinner protocols. Those sound genuinely terrifying. Vexura's laughter carried harmonics that Jake could now perceive across multiple dimensions. I'll teach you. We have time, several centuries, if the bond continues to strengthen as expected. Several centuries? Jake blinked. Did I mention I love your health plan? The longevity enhancement is a side effect of the psychic bonding, she explained. Though you'll still age, the process will be significantly slower. We'll have time to really get to know each other. Jake looked out at the ships representing two civilizations learning to become one, then at the woman whose thoughts and feelings were now permanently intertwined with his own. You know, when I woke up this morning, my biggest worry was whether I'd remembered to pack enough dress uniforms for formal occasions. And now? Now I'm wondering whether our first joint state dinner should feature human cuisine or Zephyrian delicacies, and how we're going to explain to the Galactic Council that we've just created a new form of government based on psychic marriage. Through their bond, Jake felt Vexura's contentment, the deep satisfaction of someone who had carried responsibility alone for centuries and could finally share that burden with someone who truly understood it. I think, she said, we're going to change the galaxy. Probably, Jake agreed. Though let's start with not accidentally starting any more wars during our honeymoon period. Agreed. Though I should warn you, the ceremonial wedding rituals alone will take approximately 6 months to complete properly. Jake groaned. Please tell me that doesn't involve 47 different dinner protocols. Only 32, Vexura said innocently. The other 15 are breakfast protocols. As their shared laughter echoed across the crystal spires of the palace, human and Zephyrian ships continued their joint patrols overhead, while two civilizations began the long, complicated, and ultimately rewarding process of learning to become one people under the guidance of leaders who had chosen love over war, unity over division, and the courage to reach across the void between worlds to build something greater than either could achieve alone.